Hey everyone, here is your organization of the nervous system section and video lecture. So, yeah, we have all these nerves in our body. Now, the next question is how are they set up? And we can actually organize them into different groups of nerves or neurons that have specific jobs for that certain area that they're found in, which allows us to organize them very easily. So first up, and I might argue potentially the most important, is our central nervous system. So we have our brain, which has our cerebrum, which is the higher order or higher level of function that our brain and our nervous system can do. It's called the seat of consciousness. It's thought that all the interactions on this particular part of our brain provides our consciousness, and it's divided into the left and right hemispheres. We will take a look at an image shortly, but for now you can even just picture or bring up or Google a quick image of brain, and it should help show this. So yeah, there's a left and right hemisphere of the cerebrum, and it's primarily the cerebral cortex, which is made out of 4 different lobes and is primarily something called gray matter, which we'll come to learn is slower signaling, which is good because that allows integration of information. For example, we have our occipital lobe, which allows us to integrate visual information, temporal lobe, which has centers for language and auditory signals. We have our parietal, which is our sensory input area, if you will, and it's very closely related both in structure and location to our motor cortex as well. And we have our frontal lobe, which is the primarily organization center and allows us to consciously control how we move, and quote unquote organizes our thought, which apparently was slowing me up there a bit. Okay, I digress. What else do we have going on? Well, we have our cerebellum, which is the broccoli tree sort of component that's down at the base and the back. And that helps with muscle coordination and things that we don't think about, like balance and posture. It's just kind of there, always doing its work that way. Our diencephalon, which you can also think of as your midbrain. It contains our hypothalamus and our hippocampus and a lot of other very important brain structures related to memory, and the hypothalamus being like relay centers or thermostats. So again, if we're thinking about homeostasis and what helps keep us within that range, the hypothalamus is a very helpful brain system to do, or center for that. And then last but not least, we have our brainstem, which includes our medulla oblongata and pons, which we covered previously in our respiratory chapter. Our lower midbrain, it regulates things that we don't think about, like heartbeats, breathing, blood pressure, and it says reflexes, but we'll be more specific about what that is a bit later on. So we have, let's, I want to show you the brain first. Okay, so as promised, here's an image of the brain, our central nervous system. So we have our frontal lobe, which the central sulci, a sulci is just like, you can think of it as a big canyon in our brain. So we have a central sulci here that divides our frontal and parietal lobes. Okay, so our parietal lobe is kind of the green and this blue. So it's anything to the right of the central sulci, and everything to the left here of the central sulci is our frontal lobe. We have our temporal lobe here. Again, that's where we have some more language type related input. Our cerebellum, there's that cauliflower looking thing. This is why I said cauliflower, because when you transect it, it looks like that. Or take a planar view of it. And last but not least, we have our occipital lobe, which is part of the parietal, which allows us to have visual centers. Okay, Yes. Oh, sorry. I guess we can talk about the diencephalon a bit. So here's our thalamus, our hypothalamus, pituitary gland. These are all really important in homeostatic regulations. And here's our lower brain with the pons and medulla oblongata. Okay, great. Central nervous system, done. But how does that fit in with other parts of our body and other systems? Well, as I mentioned, our nervous system overall is actually divided into two systems. We already spoke about our central nervous system, in particular the brain, but the brain will also, or the central nervous system will also include the spinal cord and some interneurons. And we'll see that a lot of interneurons are actually found in the spinal cord. We'll take a look at what that looks like. So ultimately, just for memory's sake, to try to group things together, you can think central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. But we have this whole other organizational structure of neurons and nerves in our body, the peripheral nervous system. So we have our motor or efferent neurons and our sensory or afferent neurons, okay? And how do we remember the word efferent and afferent? Well, you can think of signals coming from or to the central nervous system. So we have our brain, our spinal cord, and any nervous signals that are exiting or leaving the central nervous system are likely to be going to muscles to help us move around. Any information coming up our spinal cord into or arriving at our brain, afferent, are our sensory neurons. Now, together, what these types of neurons do in our peripheral nervous system is farther subdivide into systems called the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Now, I want to start at the autonomic because I feel that's a little bit easier to understand and know what it does. Primarily, the autonomic nervous system is involuntary and does things without our thought. So, we'll dive into exactly what that is, but it's any response that our body has that we don't actually think about. The somatic, on the other hand, is voluntary. So if we choose to move our skeletal muscle, that is a somatic. So somatic also has another word. Maybe you've heard of like somatic therapy work or something like that, but it's all very body focused. So again, somatic means body. Soma, if you think about the word for a nerve cell body, a soma is the word for that. So somatic is voluntary. We use our body, our skeletal muscle. Autonomic, involuntary. Okay, and we have two more further subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic motor systems. Okay, so what is the difference between these? Well, it's a scale of the two responses that we can our bodies can produce to different situations. It's come up before in I believe it was the cardiovascular system where I said that there's one part of our nervous system that is fight or flight and another that is rest and digest. So that's these two systems here. So our sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, and parasympathetic is relaxation and digestion. Okay. One point that I will highlight right now is that the neurotransmitter typically involved with the sympathetic nervous system is noradrenaline, whereas our neurotransmitters for our parasympathetic nerves are acetylcholine. Okay, so it's really important to know that at the end of these nerves, at the different systems that they interact, they usually interact with the same system. And so this is why it's so important to know that the sympathetic motor system uses noradrenaline, because that will go to certain receptors and elicit certain responses on target organs. And in a different feedback mechanism, our parasympathetic nervous system will use acetylcholine to cue up the desired response in recipient organs on that end for that system. Okay, so now that we had that overview, again, just to finish off with the central nervous system, again, we have our spinal cord, which branches nerves out. And I think of most importance, though, now that we're had a bit of an idea, knowing that There's voluntary and involuntary actions that can happen, is this idea of reflex actions. One of your slides mentioned it earlier as being in the central nervous system while we're discussing the brain, but truly it's more, it occurs more in the spinal cord, okay? And that's with the help of interneurons. So let's investigate our peripheral nervous system. So it's made up of neurons and ganglia. So ganglia are groups of nerve cell bodies. That's typically, they extend from the central nervous system. They reach out to all our periphery, hence why it's called peripheral nervous system. As I mentioned, there's two divisions of our autonomic nervous system, and we have our sensory somatic. Oh, I think what's interesting to see anyway about how the nerves come out of the spinal cord, even though this is our central nervous system, but it's just interesting to see the different cross dissections at each of these vertebrae levels, how we tends to get a little wider or narrower depending on how our vertebral column is and how many nerve tracts are running through it at that particular point in time. Okay. To get back on track here, our autonomic nervous system, as I mentioned before, this is the stuff that we don't think about, and it helps control our heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, breathing, all the things we don't think about, and it's subdivided into the fight or flight and the rest and digest, or the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. You can say SNS or PNS as well, and autonomic nervous system, not to confuse things, is ANS. So all of these can be shortened into acronyms. So a demonstration here highlighting how interneurons work in the spinal cord to create reflexes. So again, here, if a hammer hits the knee, it causes a reflex. And how does that happen? Well, our sensory nerves in our muscle, or in particular muscle spindle fibers, sense that quick shortening. It's a mechanoreceptor, sends a signal to the spinal cord. It does not go to the brain. It essentially short circuits, and we get an instant reaction to help protect the muscle. So our motor neuron here receives a response, and hence we kick our knee when we've had the hammer at the doctor hit our patellar tendon. Maybe you've had this done before, maybe not. Something fun to play around with at home if you wanted to try out. Okay. So that was our parasympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system, again, is our fight or flight, and this is important. So this is one subdivision of our peripheral nervous system, or PNS. So sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, stimulated when you want to survive the situation, or if there's something stressful, increases the heart rate, gets blood pressure up, more blood flow to muscles, there's more energy released by the liver, so more blood glucose, and we break down glycogen in muscles for energy there as well. So it's triggered by danger, thrills, excitement, and exercise. And depending on what time of year, this is a little timely. So if it's a fall semester, we're nearing spooky season with Halloween. If it's winter, Valentine's Day is somewhat close to this timing. So again, both times a year, either semester, our sympathetic nervous system, good cause to get thrilled and excited, aside from the exercise we regularly do, of course. Okay. There's one other type of, I'm not going to say reflex, but helpful thing that our autonomic system does, and in this case, it's something called reciprocal innervation. And so we have these interneurons, but this highlights, and I wanted to bring this up because it highlights how, when, say, we're exercising or working out, we have these neurons that actually feed back and have a negative feedback loop occurring in through our spinal cord as a reflex. Okay, so we get this signal when we go to exercise. that enters our nervous system. We know we're working out. We have this inhibitory interneuron. So when we want to contract this muscle, we see that we get this signal to downplay the contraction that occurs in this muscle. Okay, so this goes back to what we've learned so far about agonist and antagonist muscle groups. So as one, say in a bicep curl, as my bicep contracts, the tricep's gonna not contract. And the reason for that is if they both contracted, my arm wouldn't go anywhere. You can try to feel this for yourself as well on your own arm. So again, if I'm contracting my bicep, my tricep isn't contracting, okay? It needs to be able to get longer for my elbow to bend, okay? So one is a agonist and the other is antagonist muscle. And so this works through this little feedback interneuron exchange between our alpha motor neurons. Okay, peripheral nervous system, as we were saying, we had our sympathetic, now we have our parasympathetic, rest and digest, so it'll do essentially the opposite. I don't ever like saying it's just the opposite as a blanket statement, but it truly does. So it'll lower our blood pressure, slow our heart rate, helps shut down our our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, within that parasympathetic nervous system, we have our sensory somatic nervous system. And again, this coordinates our actions and responses to external environments. So our sensory part receives signals from our tendons, all our sensory inputs, so our five senses, and the motor division initiates contraction in muscles of limbs and movement. So these two really work together. For example, we always take in information. We can think of this in particular when we go to move. We take in sensory input from around our world, around us, and we use that to integrate, to be able to interact with it through a motor response. Okay, and I think that's the key part of that nervous system. Great, so we covered our organization of how the nervous system's set up in our bodies. Then we're going to start diving into how this recruitment of motor responses occurs, as well as how nerve conductions occur.